we do have a theist on the line, Joe from Kansas, that I am interested to talk to. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hi, V.
Hello. You have a question about criticizing faith without saying it's willful ignorance or gullibility. And I'm really interested to have this conversation with you. What have you got?
This is just a topic that I guess I've run into while perusing the skeptic community on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
Just conversations about all kinds of things, and of all people, this was a Kent Hovind debunk that I was watching, just a little bit of mindless entertainment,
mm-hmm.
And the person who was making the video was saying, was an atheist themselves, and was saying, while they are probably in the minority in the scientific community, there are, real biological, PhD evolutionary biologists who also are Christians and believe in God, and even though they believe in what I guess you would call divine evolution, the idea that yes, evolution exists and is 100% real and has the the lever of God attached to it.
Right.
And the thing that I couldn't get out of my head was, and the person said, all of these people are real doctors and really, this is no charlatan anybody. They didn't, they didn't get their doctorate in quotes from a degree mill. These are real dyed-in-the-wool scientists.
Mm-hmm.
And I just couldn't get out of my head. The thing was, the person saying, everyone takes something on faith, and I cannot remember the Bible quote off the Bible verse off the top of my head, but it's faith is belief belief in what we do not see, evidence evidence that does not exist. Belief.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I don't have the quote in my head.
I don't either. We're fine.
You know the one I'm talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
the chat will let us know.
So, you what?
The chat will let us know. They'll find it.
Yeah. So you can say that these people are scientists, and you can also say they're Christians, but if they're Christians, it's almost inevitable to say that they also have faith in their God. Faith is what they use to believe in something. Mm-hmm. So you've said, so where's the disconnect? Because if they're a scientist and you say they're a real scientist and they've done real scientific work, then how do you then say, I believe they're a scientist and I have respect for them, but also they have faith, which basically means they're gullible people who are willfully ignorant.
Right.
Which to me, and this is an argument I've had in comment sections more times than I care to admit, if you're saying someone has faith, or this is willfully ignorant, gullibility, whatever you want to call it, you're essentially saying they're stupid. It's tiptoe around it, but you're saying they're stupid.
Kind of. I think that is actually the crux of this, Joe, which is everybody has blind spots that influence how they see the world, how they do their work, even if they are really good at that work. So for me personally, I cannot speak to the comment section of atheist videos because, oh my God.
And I try not to lump everybody into that.
Nobody needs that.
That's a dangerous place to go.
No, you need to hold your breath and go in small dunks at a time. But what I would say, is that, yes, there are absolutely scientists, even, evolutionary biology-based scientists who know what they're doing and have correct information to provide us and also believe in a God. The thing is, if you are a evolutionary biologist who believes in a God and you believe in this concept of, you call it divine evolution, the idea that God kind of jump-started everything, that's not accessible to you in a lab. That is something that you are bringing to the table, but that idea won't necessarily influence the way you're doing your work. In the same way that I can believe that Lord of the Rings is the best trilogy ever written and still go in every day and help people publish their books, and my day-to-day job doing something related to books is not influenced by that belief, unless somebody comes up to me and says, this is the best trilogy ever written, and then I'll say, no, you're wrong, and we can have that argument. But there is a component of faith there that everybody who is an evolutionary biologist is bringing to the table, because it doesn't deal with that. If someone was a young Earth creationist and an evolutionary biologist, I would have questions. But if you're making a claim that isn't on the table, that doesn't really impact the work that's being done on the table, then we can argue about that, but I'm not going to automatically assume that the work you're doing in this unrelated area is wrong. So there's that. But also, I do want to make this clear, everybody has those blind spots. And when we bring up, or at least when I bring up, the blind spot of faith in a God that is being accepted without that deeper diving into apologetics and the history of the church and all of that, then what I'm saying is not, this person is stupid for believing this. I'm saying, I know I have blind spots, and I want people to point them out to me so that I can go and examine them. This is one of yours, and I'm giving you the opportunity to dive in and explore that. And the only place where willful ignorance comes into play at all is in how that conversation is received, as long as it's being done respectfully on the other end. Because if you go up to someone and you're like, you're stupid, okay, bye. You don't need to engage with that person. But if someone's honestly bringing you a problem with your worldview or an inconsistency or just something you haven't thought about before, if you decide to put that on the table and walk away from it, that is willful ignorance. And that's not unique to Christians or to theists at all. I've encountered that time and time again in the atheist community. So yes, it is calling out willful ignorance if somebody has been told multiple times about an area where they are not aware and they have never decided to go look into it anymore. But that's the only situation where that could really be considered willful ignorance. Just believing in a God isn't willful ignorance, nor is it stupidity. It's just one of the areas where maybe you need to look into a little bit more. And everybody has those. So that's kind of where I come from.
Is your example on the book publishing aspect of Lord of the Rings, but I can still publish other books or help publish other books was a great analogy. I hadn't viewed it quite in that, in that aspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or, if we were to say books were invented in the 1600s by a guy who fell out of a tree, hit his head on a rock, and imagined the first book in all its entirety. Okay, cool. My belief that that's how books were invented isn't going to impact my day-to-day publishing books, right? Unless somebody's like, no, and I believe that every author should fall out of a tree and hit their head on a rock before being published, right? Then we might have a problem. But believing in how something got started and engaging in a field of work or research that is not directly tied to that belief, yeah, there might be a little asterisk there. If you're like, hey, V is one of the primary book publishers in Austin, Texas. V also believes that books were invented in the 6th century by, XYZ. Then maybe there's a little bit of a, okay, well, I'm going to have to see. How is V's work? How does V do their work? And then you make the call from there, right? And that's an individual decision. But to say that I am not good at my job because of that belief, would be making an assumption. And that is also willful ignorance, because then you jump to that conclusion and make a decision without actually looking into it, right?
Sure.
So that's my 2 cents. What are your thoughts?
I guess as you said, is like, as long as your example of if someone is an evolutionary biologist and also a young earth creationist, then those are 2 things that conflict heavily.
Right.
But like being an astronomer and also a young earth creationist, then so long as the 2 things aren't directly contradicting one another or very closely coming to contradict one another, then it doesn't quite matter. That's not really the right word. But,
right. You can't make the assumption that an assumption that one is directly correlated to the other in that person's mind if they aren't necessarily correlated. So
right.
You would have to probably go research, right? Like if I were given a piece of compelling information by an evolutionary biologist who also happened to be a Christian, I would do a little bit more research. Did they get their diploma from a legitimate university? What other papers have they published? Like, have they come out and like done an interview where they talk about how their faith interacts with their work? Like, all of those things I would then look into, but I couldn't just learn this evolutionary biologist is a Christian. Well, I'm tossing this paper out. That would be jumping to a conclusion, and that would be a blind spot that I would have as an atheist that I would need to dive into,
Sure. And I guess I'm going to kind of veer off in another direction here just for a moment. But as you described, since everyone has blind spots, it's okay to say, willful ignorance isn't just believing in a God. It's how you got to that point, and have you looked at it closer? Have you examined it?
Yeah.
And I think in that regard, that almost causes a couple problems of its own, seeing as how some things have to be marked as like in the category of the unknowable, because I don't think I called in. This was a month or 2 ago. I don't think you were on. I'm pretty sure it was the episode that Russell Glasser was on. And I called in and asked about a conversation I had with someone who was an agnostic atheist, say, I don't believe in a God, but I'm open to being convinced.
do remember that call, yeah.
It says, and then the aspect was, they said, the only way you could prove to me that Jesus, crucified and died and then rose from the dead 3 days later was if I could see, if he was crucified and brought down, if I could see a modern day autopsy done on him and be able to have someone specifically say, yes, this person is 100% dead, and then see the same person walking around 3 days later. And the thing was, that person to me is no longer an agnostic atheist. That's a Gnostic atheist. Because if your only standard of evidence requires a time machine, you're not open to being convinced.
That is a good rule of thumb. I've got one similar, which is if you have to appeal to hard solipsism, I win.
Right.
But yeah, if you need something that is impossible in order to prove something to you, then up until that thing can be proven, you are agnostic about it. And that needs to be something that you like you cannot make a claim about that thing until the ability to prove it to your satisfaction exists. So maybe one day when time machines happen, that person, can get their evidence. But until then, if they cannot make a very firm claim about X thing beyond, I don't know, right? And so for me, that is applicable both directions. And so I'm not going to say that you are not sufficiently convinced of a God and maybe those criteria have been met for you. But in my worldview, I do not see a way for that to actually be proven to me. And so I consider that a question that is unanswerable currently. And so I cannot make an assertion whether or not said God exists. I need to be in the space if I don't know if I'm going to be, actively consistent in my own brain. And if a Christian or a theist says, I also don't know, then we get to have the conversation. Okay, so what are we choosing to do with that lack of knowledge? And how is that informing other beliefs and other parts of our worldview? And that can be a really interesting conversation to have. But yeah, absolutely. If the requirements for meeting for provability are impossible, then you are agnostic about that claim.
And yeah, is the bringing up this for you, you said, it's nothing has been, there hasn't been something that has been an answer that has sufficiently answered the question for you. Then I guess that applies to everyone else as well, and goes back to, can someone be an evolutionary biologist and also a Christian? Because even if they, believe evolutionary biology, Christianity could, their Christian faith could be just reduced to personal experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as long as they don't bring that ability to accept a thing
and as
based
long as it doesn't affect
exactly. And that's
the science part of it.
Right. And that's the whole ball game. If you want to believe something and you're going to be able to keep it in a space where it doesn't negatively impact other people or your work, I have no problem with you. And I'm not going to make assumptions about other people in your life or your work without seeing for myself, skepticism, what that actually, what your faith does in those situations. It's the only asterisk there, again, is, okay, well, if this person is saying that they believe things based on personal experience, that does conflict with the scientific method. So let's just make sure that when they're actually doing science, they're following these rules and not the ones they've set up for themselves outside of those rules.
Right. It's not, 2 + 2 = 4 because that's how I feel about it.
Right.
It's 2 + 2 = 4 because logic and etc.
Right. Yeah. Joe, I hope that this helped. I know that watching these, refutations on YouTube, especially about people who I'm pretty sure you also disagree with in terms of how they're using their faith, can be so frustrating. But I hope that
I need to stay off YouTube.
It's I mean, it's a choice. Hopefully this helped, and hopefully this gave you a little bit of clarity that when you go into these conversations in the YouTube comments, Godspeed, you are able to maybe dive into things a little bit more deeply with the people who want to have that conversation with you.
Right. Thanks, Steve.
Absolutely. Thank you for calling in.
Yep.
Bye.